This is Nan McKay, and I would like to introduce you today to Kathy Lawless. Kathy Lawless is the creative coach for those individuals who want to honor the lives of someone important to them in a unique and creative way that tells their story. With over 2 decades of leadership experience in corporate, nonprofit, consulting roles, Kathy has successfully made several transitions in her life, reinventing herself multiple times. She has a podcast series entitled, How Did I Get Here? Let's find out about her multiple lives and what most intrigues her today. So welcome, Kathy.
Thanks, Nan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, let's start out with, I'm curious about how you got here. So growing up, how did your early life affect who you are today?
I love that question. I actually opened my podcast with a similar icebreaker around, where did you grow up and birth order and all of that. So I would say a big part of my early life that impacted me is I am a middle child. I have 2 sisters, and so there was 3 of us in 3 years. In fact, my sisters are born on the same day, 3 years apart. So my older sister always says my younger sister kind of ruined her birthday. And of course, my younger sister says, I think I was the best gift you ever got. But anyway, as a middle child, I have those typical middle child tendencies. And a big part of that is harmony, compromising, adaptability. I always wanted to make sure everything kind of went okay and that was smoothed out. And the 2 sisters being, I think, so similar, being born on the same day, very strong personalities, they kind of sometimes butted heads, and I had to be that mediator, and I tended to either be with one or the other. And so kind of, I was in the middle. And it's funny how when I take personality tests now and look back on my life, I'm very much in the middle on so many things on those tests, but also, harmony, compatibility, that stuff really just reigns out in my leadership, but also just in my personality throughout.
So have you taken the DISC profile?
I haven't taken it recently. I've taken a lot like Myers-Briggs and Emergenetics and the StrengthsFinder tools. And so those are where I see like harmony, adaptability, responsibility. Some of those were what came out of my StrengthsFinder tool.
Yeah, probably blue, I think, if it's the same tool, and you're probably a high S. So interesting, and it's interesting to see how all those things twist together and play out in who you really are.
Totally. And I think I also had a little bit of an identity crisis that I don't know what I wanted. And I didn't realize this until just like in the last, I think, 4 or 5 years of my life. When I think about having such strong sisters, I was always doing something with one or the other and doing what they wanted. So when I had to really look at, well, what do I want? That wasn't always factored in. So it was hard for me to define it, right? And come up with that, not only, just when I'm around them, but also then when I'm, looking at career and lifestyle and different choices here and there.
Absolutely. And you spent over 2 decades in corporate, nonprofit, and consulting roles. So tell me about some of your experiences in those roles that kind of made you who you are today.
Yeah, I think all 3 of us have natural leadership abilities, and I don't know how that happened exactly, but even when I started at the Dairy Queen, back when I was 15, I was, closing the shop very early, high responsibility. And just, I don't know, we were brought up to be responsible, do things right the first time. So when I got into the corporate space and into, just working, as an adult, I just naturally kind of stepped into some of those roles, and I was willing to, right? I think sometimes leadership is about willingness to do it. And, because it's not easy, and there's a lot of criticism that goes with it. But I had the fortunate, I think, again, part of my harmony and adaptability is I ended up being in a lot of roles where I was leading change initiatives that were across a product or a division or even the organization. So I was leading change with cross-functional teams which means I didn't always have the direct authority of those teams reporting into me. I had to influence with my personal power and my personality, right? And so part of my personality is I want to be liked. And so I wanted to be, how do we move things forward? I was really, trying to motivate and influence in a way that got people to want to work with me, not because, we had to get, I wasn't using the stick. I was always using the carrot and that approach. So that was, again, so I think back to my harmony days and adaptability. I wasn't too much of the hard driver in those meetings.
But you really increased your communication skills, it sounds like.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And when you, since that was kind of my experience in the corporation that I worked for, which was a large corporation. I mean, it was a multi-billion-dollar organization. It was First Data, which was a payment processor. And so I had access, I worked with legal and finance and marketing and sales and operations, so you had to be able to speak and interpret and communicate with all of those different roles. And get, very clear on, well, what's the goal, the mission, and how do they fit into that? But those skills also became transferable when I started volunteering for nonprofit organizations, being on boards, and you work with a lot of volunteers. Well, it's the same thing. Volunteers aren't there to be, they want to contribute in a very positive way. They're, so they want, tell us what to do. Again, it's influence without, having direct authority. It's engaging people to want to work with you, creating an environment where people want to work their best. So I think how I worked in corporate then led to how I worked in the nonprofits, whether I was on the board or then I was an interim CEO and president. But then also when I started back consulting into corporations, same thing. When you come in as a consultant, you don't have a lot of direct authority. So everything is about that personal power and communication and influence.
So what would you say is the secret to being able to have that positive communication?
Well, I think you got to get to know folks. And so there's kind of that, likability just from the beginning because you have a little bit of a rapport. But it's also finding out what kind of drives them and why they're even there. Specifically, I think when you're in the nonprofit space, there's a lot of reasons why people either volunteer or want to be part of an organization. And so if you can find that and then tap into that, and then that's why they're there. So then you can leverage that. And also, I think that get that good fit in terms of when they want to volunteer. Well, what might be that great cohort or that committee or what fits their personality? So yeah, I guess I look at all of those things. It's funny. Yeah, I don't really break that down, Nan, into steps. It just kind of is, who you are after a time, right? Well, I ask a lot of questions. Maybe that's part of it. I tend to be a questioner and a listener and an observer. And then now what are we going to do with that? And then connecting people.
That does sound like it makes sense. I'm thinking, is it more difficult in the volunteer area in the sense that there's less commitment sometimes to show up or more cancellation of being at work than there would be in just a regular business?
Absolutely. That, it's a great observation because people have the best intentions that, oh, I'm here to be on this committee and I'm going to help put this retreat on or put on this event that you've got going. And I think a lot of times there's a misnomer when you're on a board of advisors or a board of directors that, oh, well, we'll just get volunteers to come in and help run these things. Well, there comes a point where they're like, well, hey, I'm not going to be there because I got called out of town for my job. And you're like, oh, well, we were counting on you. Who's the backup? And have you trained? Well, no, I don't have time to do that. I'm actually leaving, next week or whatever. So yeah, it can be a big risk when you're in that volunteer space. And so you do have to kind of, I think you learn as you go through some of those situations. You're like, okay, we're not going to let that happen again. This is really a staff position or a team position versus a volunteer, even though people are like, well, let's just get volunteers. There's all kinds of volunteers who want to help. There's a difference between having those volunteer roles and then having, you need to have real roles, real paid roles.
Yeah, absolutely right. Tell us a story about the most important contribution that you've made when you're talking about blazing trails for other women to follow.
Well, I tell you, I'm very proud of what I've done for Blazing Trails, and and I wouldn't have said that normally, I think, except for you asked that question in that way. But so I was part of an organization called the Women's Vision Foundation, and we later changed our name to the Leadership Investment. And this organization was very impactful for me as a young emerging woman leader, in that I got exposed to it as I was starting out and kind of one of those high potential leaders. My boss said, "Oh, I'd like you to be part of this organization." And I got thrown into this program where I was exposed to other women leaders who were more senior, and got to learn about things about power and work-life balance and character and different things. And so as I was kind of coming up through the ranks, those things I paid more attention to as an observer of other leaders, but then who was the leader that I wanted to be? And then as my career and my confidence grew, then I got asked to start being more of a mentor and coming into that organization. And then ultimately I was asked to co-lead one of their events, and then asked to join the board. And then when I was on the board, I was asked to be on the executive committee and then chairperson. So when I look at my career and how that organization helped my career, it was a big part of a confidence booster, a network booster, kind of rose me up. And so then a big part of that organization was, how do we give back? In fact, our theme and our whole tagline and our brand promise was a hand forward and a hand back. And so that was just what we did. And that's what we kind of oozed. That was our secret sauce. And so we put on for 19 years a Women's Success Forum that was a day-long event about education and inspiration and building awareness about gender biases, and but also about gender accomplishments, right? And the success stories of women leaders and those organizations that were really working hard to raise up women leaders. So we were recognizing those. For 10 years, we put on a mentors walk where we paired, senior leaders with emerging leaders. And again, this is all around raising up women. And then I was part of a mentor circle. So I can kind of go on and on. It was a great organization. I was part of it for 20 years. It did decide to close its doors. And so I'm now very sad about that. But another part of that organization, another cohort, so to speak, lives on. And it's a group of us called the Wise Women. And so we still continue to help ourselves, help support one another, because it can be lonely, right? Being women leaders. Many times you're the only woman in the room, or many times you're the only one in your industry. And so how can we be there to support one another and help one another thrive?
And I've found that in most organizations, there is, in a sense, a hierarchy in that if you want to move up in the organization, they're looking for people who are going to be committed, who they can count on, but you do have to go through each level in order to get toward the top. And you have to have a lot of patience for that. And a lot of people don't have that patience, in a sense, on paying their dues. But it seems like most organizations are like that. Did you find that?
Yeah, I would say when I was at First Data, I was there for 20 years. It was very clear what the hierarchy was. And you know what, at the time, it kind of worked for me, Nan. I was able to navigate that well. In fact, I was one of my sisters, and I always talked about how corporate really fit for us because you kind of knew the structure. And so you kind of had this career path of up and to the right, you just wanted to keep getting promoted and taking on more leadership. My other younger sister was more entrepreneurial. And my older sister and I were like, oh, we don't have the entrepreneurial gene. And I don't think we can turn things off when we go home if I was an entrepreneur. So corporate worked for me for quite a while. In fact, that women's leadership organization I was in really catered to corporate women because the politics in being in a corporation is very different, and navigating the space and the opportunities that come up and how do you set yourself up for that is very different than when you're an entrepreneur.
So how do you navigate that space? What would be your advice?
Well, my main advice would be is you got to let people know what you want. And being someone who I said at the beginning, I didn't know what I wanted. That was kind of tough for me at times. But I would say early in my career, I got tapped frequently because they saw potential and talent. But there does come a point when you get into a career where people aren't tapping you anymore, and you really have to create create that next role for yourself. And it is about communicating and working with mentors and other people that are going to advocate for you. And that was, I think, a big part that I learned through that women's leadership organization was how do you advocate for yourself in a way that feels comfortable for you and authentic for you, but then how do you find those others that are going to advocate for you? And many times that's going to be men, many times it's going to be women, but you've got to find those leaders that are going to advocate, or you're not even going to get invited to be in the room. You're not going to be in the room. They're just going to make a lot of decisions without you. So you really, you got to get in the room and you got to be at the table.
There's a lot of discussion today about women over 50 who are, let's say, either given less plum roles or even being forced out of corporations as they get to the top. Are you hearing anything like that, or have you seen anybody or talked to anybody that's experienced that?
I haven't. What I'm seeing more of is women over 50 opting out. That, they call it kind of the hamster wheel. I'm tired of the hamster wheel. What's going to be next? And that organization that I mentioned, the Wise Women, we've got about 75 women in that. And they were that, kind of the criteria at one point was that we were at either in the C-suite or reporting to the C-suite in corporate. But kind of once you get into that organization and how do we support one another, you realize there's different chapters in people's lives. So I'm finding a lot of my cohorts in that group are moving either to leading maybe a nonprofit. So they're still in a leadership role, but they're doing it in a more maybe meaningful capacity, making a bigger difference in the world than just kind of the capital difference in their big corporation, which at one point was very satisfying and felt like they were making a difference. But then sometimes it's about stepping into that nonprofit space or maybe stepping into a coaching space. So I almost feel like there's a little bit of a stepping out, but it's by choice more than being forced.
Interesting. What do you think was the biggest hurdle that you had to overcome to get to where you are today?
My biggest hurdle has been that little critic in my head. It has at different times, it was very loud, and I worked pretty hard to turn the volume down and pretty hard to reprogram it. You can't really, and I don't know if others have this same thing. I think most people do, because it does come up quite a bit, right? About what does that little voice tell you? I've heard, I interviewed someone on my podcast, and she said she didn't have the worry gene. She just didn't inherit it. And I'm like, wow, that would have been so refreshing, because I think I had a little too much of the worry gene and tend to overthink things. So I will say, I think to get over it, I've taken some classes, I've done some leadership, a lot of, deep reflection and books and things of that nature, but also talking with others. And when you start recognizing that others have, their critics and their doubts and their fears, et cetera, some people call it sometimes the imposter syndrome. And I don't know that I would say that was it 100%. It was really more that critic in my head, and how do I reprogram that? And I think it's an age thing too. As I've gotten older, I think you get wiser, but maybe you also give yourself a little bit more grace than you did when you were younger.
Well, I think the critic in our head can erode our self-confidence too, because even though it may not be labeled as the imposter syndrome, and a lot of the people that I've interviewed have talked about this, and I talk about this in my book that's coming out, and so it must be pretty prevalent. But did you find that self-confidence was the bottom line of what you felt you were missing?
Absolutely. It was, I had this kind of worldview of myself that I wasn't enough. And so, or maybe the who am I to interject, or who am I to add to this? Or, I remember sitting in a staff meeting at one point, and I had been in I was leading the client service team for a while, a couple 3 years. And then they brought in a change agent because there was a lot of change needed to happen. And I was offered the choice of sticking in the leading the service department, or if I wanted to step into doing special initiatives or strategic initiatives. And I opted to step out because I was just at a point where I was burned out and I thought that seemed a little more interesting. What I didn't realize is sometimes when you step into the strategic initiatives or special projects, there's an end to those much sooner than when you're running a department, right? So anyway, so I get into this role doing special projects, and then I'm in the staff meeting and I'm not feeling as critical to the business as all of my colleagues. And I got to tell you, that little voice just would wreak havoc on, oh my gosh, so-and-so just said that. He always has such great ideas. He's such a visionary. Why aren't I a visionary? And then, my other colleague, she says something and, oh, look, now she brings it back and here, look at this. And it was this observation and this conversation in my head. Was I present? Did I need to be adding anything? No, I just needed to be present and be part of it and recognize I didn't need to be contributing to that particular discussion. But I don't know, that's just one example of how, it crept into my head, that self-doubt, which then leads to, you leave the room. And then how does that put you in position to go to the next meeting and the next meeting and the next day and things of that nature? So.
Well, what would you advise someone else in that position today if they encountered that self-confidence problem and the worry about, am I in the right spot? Am I contributing what I should, et cetera?
I think you got to get a coach. And if you're in a leadership role, you got to have coaches, all professional high performers, whether you're an athlete or I think in business, you got to have coaches. You got to have people that you can talk to, a trusted advisor. Sometimes it can be a colleague, but sometimes that doesn't feel good. So you need that confidence booster. I will tell you, I used my sisters a lot on that front, but I also, I did have several coaches that I hired over the years. One I might even say is more of a therapist to help with that negative voice. So if it's prevalent and it's really loud, you got to figure out a way to turn that down because it's going to really paralyze you. Because, we can do and be so much if we believe that. But if you don't believe that, you really, you just keep, you're not going to be thriving. So I highly recommend getting coaches and don't stay in your head. You got to get it out. And it's funny, once you talk about it, then it's gone. Then it sounds silly. It was sometimes when I talk about it, that was what was holding me back. But many times people will say when I interview them in their podcast, and my podcast too, I held my own self back, right?
Well, you've reinvented yourself really multiple times. Would you say there is a thread anywhere that prompted the changes?
Yeah, I would say I'm someone who has that growth mindset or learning and grow. I'm always wanting to be learning. And I think some of that was driven by, am I good enough? You know what I mean? So I was trying to be better and trying to be the best I could be. When I finally realized I just wanted to grow and learn, that was such a relief, right? To be, exploring these different concepts, either about leadership or like just this morning, I was on as part of this Wise Women group. Well, one of the leaders, she has a PhD. She did a webinar on the 12 keys of thriving. Well, those are the kind of things that just interest me, right? Well, what does help us all thrive as individuals? So I think when I reinvent myself, I'm always kind of looking for, well, who am I being? How do I want to show up in the world? What's fun? What's exciting? And that's been more of a recent thing, Nan. I think that's kind of an age thing, right? You start looking at different ways. When you're younger, it's about, oh, I was a manager and then I wanted to be a director and then a vice, some of that was more title. And I wanted to lead this big project because I've never led something of that size before. Now that I'm older, I'm like, oh, well, what else could I be doing that's meaningful? And how can I be contributing in a different way? And how can I be connecting people and ideas, et cetera?
Yeah, I think there is an age factor to that where you're just a little more introspective and you're also looking for something that's more collaborative, more give back, more something that you feel you could really make a difference in life. When you're really young, it just seems like everything is striving. Either you're striving for the next position or you're striving for acceptance or whatever it is. You're just trying to put one foot in front of the other because you got kids to get off to school, et cetera, et cetera. Once you get past those stages, you kind of have time to think about a little more of those things. Do you feel that way?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, go ahead.
I like your point about collaboration. I do look at that's now being an entrepreneur, a solopreneur. I look at how do I find ways to collaborate with others, because it's lonely, right? When you're running your own thing and it's just you, it's I need people, and I find I do better with people and brainstorming and bouncing ideas off of each other. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a saying that I have said a long time because I started my business back in 1980. And my saying is, it's lonely at the top because you can't really discuss some of the problems in depth in every way with employees. So you have to figure out, gosh, I'm talking to myself all the time. And that's where you said if you get a coach, it can be helpful. It's more prevalent today. Back in 1980, I mean, nobody had coaches.
Yeah, it wasn't.
No. You know, I think every decision kind of takes you one direction or another. Which decision, if you think back, can you pinpoint something that most influenced where you are in your life today?
Well, I got to give so much credit to my decision to marry my husband. He is soulmate. I don't know, just love him to death. And I think we're going, maybe he's so top of mind because we're coming up on our 25-year anniversary in March. But, when you do look at prior, I had been married once before, he had been too. And so each of us, it's a second marriage. But when I look at relationships before that, when we got together, the two of us combined just kind of took off. So when you have such a strong foundation and great support system and amazing collaboration at home, then everything else can be so easy. So I always have to credit that first because it's just so wonderful. The second would be, I think, when I did decide to start my own business after leaving a corporate world and then doing some consulting. It's been a tough road. And it's been one, I think I mentioned, I don't feel like I had the natural DNA of an entrepreneur. Some people are just like, oh, I don't want to work for other people. I've always wanted to work for myself, trust my ideas, love my ideas. I'm out there doing things, and I'm more like, So, deciding to take what was a hobby for me and turn it into a business was a pretty big decision. In fact, for probably a year, I didn't really make the decision. I was trying to get validation from others. And then I read that book, You Are a Badass, How to Stop Doubting Yourself and Live a Fantastic Life or Awesome Life. And in it was basically saying, look at your language and what are you saying? And are you looking at validation or are you just going? I'm like, you know what? I'm going to do this. And as soon as I said I was going to do it, then a business coach kind of came across my path. You know how that happens, right? As soon as you open your mind to, I'm doing this, then things just are attracting to you. And so that decision then has really shaped my life for the last 5 years. Being that solopreneur, launching a new business, Life Story Curator, and really stepping into something that's so different than corporate, but yet so meaningful for me. I get to help people capture and celebrate their life and career stories, and give families access to these stories. It's very powerful.
Tell us a little more about what you do with Life Story Curator.
Well, basically, I help people move their memories from the basement to the coffee table. So here's an example of one of the photo books or coffee table books that I help people curate and create. And so it's so meaningful. It's when you look back on your life and your career, sometimes it can feel like a blur, and you've accomplished a lot. So how do you really celebrate that? And so in fact, when I left corporate after 20 years, I gotta tell you, I kind of had this sad feeling of, well, what do I have to show for 20 years? And when I was in corporate leading teams and projects, as I mentioned, I always had this desire to celebrate at the end of a project, because many times they were anywhere from 6 months, 12 months, 18 months long. People came and went, right? So I always at the end would do something that brought everybody together and say, okay, IT, you were at the beginning. And how do we celebrate that? Or the legal team and the, accounting, finance, you were at the beginning doing the due diligence, but now we're closing. And, so how do you celebrate that? And so, that's just in me to want to celebrate and recognize. And that's what Life Story Curator does, is how do we really step back and pause and, bring that, celebration to the forefront. So I hope that helps explain. I don't feel like I've done justice.
Well, you said it was a hobby before you started the business?
Yeah. So my grandparents celebrated their 75 years of marriage. Can you believe 75 years being married? And so when we went up to celebrate that, I just had this idea to kind of put together a timeline of what were all of the kind of milestones that were happening. Like they got married in the 30s. They started having kids in the 30s. Anyway, so I did it like a family timeline, and then I added to it, well, what was going on in the world? Because without the context of what was going on in the world, what was happening to the family in the 30s was very meaningful, right? So then I put the timeline, and then I added pictures. And so that was kind of my first book. And then my friend's parents were celebrating their 60th anniversary. So we put together a book for them. One of the things I realized when I first started doing books for parties and photo books, and maybe just scrapbooking even, was that when you finished, you had one. Now you had one version of this thing. Well, once I found digital photo books that you can do online, it's like, oh, now we can make multiple copies because I want a copy of my friend's 50th birthday party and I want a copy, and so do all the other relatives. So I had been doing it for friends and family, and then thought, well, what if I, and I've been doing it to celebrate projects. What if I did something that was more meaningful, as a business? So that's when I launched Life Story Curator, is to make, to really see if people wanted to help with, moving those memories from the basement to the coffee table.
I think one of the biggest challenges people feel that there is in starting a business is the potential financial risk. So what kind of financial risks were there in starting a business, and how did you deal with that?
That's a great question. And that was another little mindset issue I had to get over. Nan, was, when you're in corporate and earning bonuses and salaries and stock options and all that, so your idea of success is kind of at a certain level. The good news is, because of that, I had, financial means that I could start a business. There wasn't a lot of overhead needed to start my business, and I still don't have a lot of overhead in my business. So there hasn't been a lot of financial risk, in my opinion, as much as there has been a financial shift in my mindset about what I'm earning, what does success look like, what do I want the business to be, what's my pricing, what's my value. So I really had to overcome some financial mindset items around that very thing, selling myself in a way of, now I'm selling this creative side of myself. Whereas before, when I was in business, I was selling, leadership and skills and attributes. And it just felt a lot different putting myself out there. So that was probably the bigger risk for me, was selling myself, putting myself out there, and then kind of stepping back from the expectations of what I had been earning before and what was realistic to earn in a new small business.
I have found that marketing is probably my biggest expense of everything that I do. And I'm wondering, there's probably a lot of word of mouth marketing in your field. Do you also have to market outside of that?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I don't spend a lot on marketing like you would see for a lot of products. But you're spot on, man. I would say in fact, I just did my books, and marketing, networking, what I'm doing to put myself out there is very big. And it's also one of the reasons that I started the podcast. I wanted to be telling more stories. And when you do a project like, a life story book like this, she was 80 years old. This book has 70 some pages of her life. Well, that's a big project to embark on. Well, I wanted to be telling more stories. So that's why I started the podcast, is how can I get people to tell their stories? If they're not willing to embark on, the 3 to 6 to 9 month project, could they tell their story in an hour? And because I went through so many reinventions and transitions and times when I was felt stuck, I thought, well, I could do this. How did I get here story? Because that was always fascinating to me, is how did people get where they are in life today? And then that could help people who are just starting out, in transition, or stuck, which I had nieces and nephews doing that. So it was also a way for me to put out marketing content in a storytelling way, which I love to do. And then also what I felt really proud of, getting those stories out there and sharing the stories of my friends and family and just people I meet like you. I mean, what's been cool is that then, I meet someone new that introduces me to someone else, and like, oh, well, you need to know Nan, and she does this podcast, and, it just kind of, snowballs.
What do you think is the most difficult challenge in being a podcaster today?
Well, this is where my little mindset again creeps up on, well, am I doing enough? Right. I'm looking at your great marketing, your logos sitting behind you, oh, do I need a screen behind me? Do I need theme music? So there's always this, could I be doing more? Could I be doing more? So that I think is one of the hardest. I do have to just keep reeling my bad self in, because it is what it is. I've reached a certain point where I'm very comfortable with how it looks and feels. I get great feedback when I talk to different people. And I'm always surprised when people are like, oh, I listened to your recent interview and this is what I got out of it. And I got to tell you, that means so much to me to hear that part, to hear the feedback.
And how do you hear that? Do they email you, or how do you hear the feedback?
Well, mostly when I'm out and about. So when I'm talking to friends and family, or I'm part of the Wise Women group that I mentioned, they're a great resource, by the way, to interview, because they've, so many of them have been in such high leadership roles and all over the world, doing so many different things. That's been awesome. I'm also part of a strategic connections group, and I'm also part of an organization called the Colorado Thought Leaders Forum. So as I'm out meeting different people, some people have, are on my mailing list and have heard the podcast. Others, just someone standing there in like the circle of three, oh, well, and then you got to listen to her podcast and this and that. So primarily the feedback I get is verbal. I wish I got more comments online. That would probably be one of the other challenges. I think you probably feel this as a podcaster too, that it's like, you think people are going to post, and then there's not a lot of, there's not a lot of feedback online. And I get it. There's just so much out there anymore. It's really hard to stay up with so much volume,
but then the little voice does come up, and the little voice says, I wonder if they didn't like it. I wonder if they're listening. So yeah, I know what you mean. I really would love that. More feedback. So what do you think is an adversity that you might have overcome that women and mothers can relate to today?
Well, I got to tell you, I was very lucky that I didn't have any crazy harassment or Me Too issues as a woman in that type of adversity in my career. In fact, I was very fortunate that the women leader role models that I had at First Data were very strong and positive, and I had a lot of women bosses that were great and great role models, and even the CFO of First Data. And again, this is it was a $10 billion company at one point. What the CFO was a woman, and that's not a traditional role for women to be in the CFO, but she also brought in so many important leadership and mentoring programs that she actually stepped outside of that just financial box and went into the whole leadership and mentoring box. So I had great role models, which was awesome. And I don't have any children, so I didn't have to go through so much of the work-life balance issues. But I will say I naturally had good work-life balance. I don't know why, maybe that's my middle child thing again, but I always tried to make sure that I wasn't being that workaholic and always so I made time for work. I made time for working out and physical fitness. I made time for friends and family, made time for hobbies. So I think that really helped me stay sane, and it helped me stay, in a thriving way, and also physically fit, which I think is so hard for many women, is because they have so many demands on their time. Their own self-care is what tends to take the back seat. And so and I see it when I'm but when I'm out interacting with the Wise Women group, I see it with my friends and my family. And it's something I wish we could kind of reverse that, kind of that same thing where, put your oxygen mask on first, do your workout and your self-care first, and then take care of, but you can't, I know, because as a parent, as a mom, you got so many demands. So I don't know if I answered your question, Nan, but
yeah, that was great. What are the top, let's say 3 takeaways that you would like people to have gotten out of your interview?
I would say the first would be, that we need to take time to step back and reflect and celebrate. And, when if you have good leadership, I think in an organization, that happens regularly at the end of projects or at the, to celebrate milestone events. Sometimes it happens like annually when you start the strategic planning, and there can be a time to reflect and celebrate last year and then move into the next year. So I'm a big proponent on how do we keep celebrating to move forward. And many times that's reflecting and looking back in order to move forward. And I would say it also then helps you with the gratitude. So maybe this is item number 2, the gratitude about the people around you and how you got to where you are. Who you are today is, a compilation of not only the things that you've done, but the people that you have surrounded yourself with. And it's when you look back and be grateful for what you have and not keep looking for what you don't have or where you want to be, then life just gets a lot easier.
It sounds a lot like what I have always told my children. Be thankful for what you have. Don't always be asking for more.
I know, it's so simple, isn't it? And we all need to be reminded of that. I think as a parent, you get to use those lessons, because you see it in children, right? But when you don't have children, you have to just keep, I guess, telling the lessons to yourself.
That's true too.
I certainly don't want to hear that from my mom.
It's been so much fun talking with you. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
Any final thoughts? I think, today was just about gratitude because I attended that session this morning on thriving, and a big part of that was gratitude. So I'm very grateful that you invited me to be part of your trailblazing community and the impact. So I hope maybe I have a little bit of impact on somebody, but I guess I am about, how can I help enrich lives? And that's what I'm doing with my business. But I also, that's just me and how I show up, and how can I enrich the lives of my friends and my family. And if that's my intention for the day, then I show up very differently. And that's, I guess, how I like to get started on my day. So.
Well, thank you so much. It's been fun talking to you because, you have so much to offer. And I love that middle child theory and the concept and where you are with it and how that affects so many things. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nan. It was a pleasure being here today. And I look forward to then having you on my podcast. I think we got that scheduled coming up. So
thank you.